Imagine this. It's 2 a.m. on a freezing winter night in 1943. You're a German soldier stationed on the Eastern Front, trying to get some sleep in your trench. Suddenly, you hear it. A soft whooshing sound, like wind rustling through trees. But something feels wrong. The sound gets louder, closer. Your heart starts racing. You know what's coming. And then, without warning, the earth explodes around you. Fire, screams, chaos. By the time you look up, they're already gone, vanished into the darkness like ghosts. The other soldiers are trembling, whispering the name that terrifies them more than anything else in this war: Nachthexen, the Night Witches. But here's what makes this story even more chilling. These weren't hardened male soldiers dropping those bombs. They were young women, teenagers, some of them, girls who just a few years ago were students, teachers, factory workers, girls who had never even seen a plane up close. So how did they become Nazi Germany's most feared enemies? How did they go from ordinary Soviet women to legends who flew over 30,000 combat missions and dropped 23,000 tons of bombs on the most powerful military machine in history? This is their story, and I promise you, it's unlike anything you've ever heard. Let me take you back to June 22nd, 1941. It's a beautiful summer morning in the Soviet Union. Families are having breakfast. Children are playing in the streets. Young women are dreaming about their futures, about becoming doctors, engineers, teachers. Life feels normal, peaceful. But at exactly 3:15 a.m., that peace is shattered forever. Without any warning, without any declaration of war, over 3 million Nazi soldiers come crashing across the Soviet border. Operation Barbarossa has begun. Hitler's plan to conquer the Soviet Union and exterminate its people. Within hours, entire cities are burning. Within days, thousands of Soviet soldiers are dead or captured. Within weeks, millions of civilians are homeless, starving, watching their loved ones die in front of their eyes. The devastation is unimaginable. And among those watching their world collapse are hundreds of thousands of young Soviet women. Now, you have to understand something about Soviet women in 1941. They weren't like women in most other countries at that time. The Soviet Union, for all its flaws, had been pushing for gender equality since the 1920s. Women worked in factories. They studied engineering and science. They were doctors, mechanics, even train conductors. So when the Nazis invaded, when these women saw their fathers, brothers, and husbands marching off to fight and die, they didn't just sit back and accept it. They wanted to fight too. They demanded to fight. But there was a problem. The Soviet military, like most militaries in 1941, didn't really want women in combat roles. Sure, they'd accept women as nurses, maybe radio operators, but actual combat? Flying planes? Dropping bombs? No way. That was considered too dangerous, too difficult, too masculine. The military commanders laughed at the idea. They literally laughed. But these women weren't taking no for an answer. Thousands of them wrote letters to Stalin, to military commanders, begging to be allowed to fight. And one woman in particular wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted. Her name was Marina Roskova, and she was already a legend in the Soviet Union. In the 1930s, she had set multiple world records for long-distance flying. She was basically the Amelia Earhart of the Soviet Union. Everyone knew her name, everyone respected her, and she had direct access to Stalin himself. So Marina did something incredibly bold. She went straight to Stalin and said, "Look, we have thousands of qualified women who want to fight. Women who can fly, who can navigate, who can fight just as well as any man. Let me form all-female aviation regiments. Give us planes, give us training, and we'll prove ourselves." Now, Stalin was desperate. The war was going terribly. The Germans were advancing so fast that Moscow itself was in danger. He needed every fighter he could get. So, surprisingly, he agreed. In October 1941, Stalin signed an order authorizing the formation of 3 all-female aviation regiments. Not mixed units, all female. Female pilots, female navigators, female mechanics, female commanders, everything. This had never been done before in any country, ever. Within weeks, over 2,000 women volunteered, but they only had space for about 400, so they had to choose carefully. And the women who were selected, they came from all walks of life. Some were experienced pilots who had been flying for years. Others had barely any flight experience but were quick learners. Some were university students studying mathematics or engineering. Others were factory workers, teachers, shop assistants. The youngest was only 17 years old. 17, still a teenager. And these women were about to be thrown into the most brutal war in human history.
They were formed into 3 regiments: the 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment, the 587th Bomber Aviation Regiment, and the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. That last one, the 588th, they're the ones we're focusing on, the Night Witches. And let me tell you, their story is absolutely insane. The 588th was commanded by Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya, a tough, no-nonsense pilot who would lead this regiment for the entire war. And the planes they were given? Oh man, this is where it gets really interesting. They weren't given modern fighters or heavy bombers. No, they were given Polykarpov Po-2 biplanes. Now, if you don't know what that is, let me paint you a picture. The Po-2 was a training aircraft. It was made of plywood and canvas. Canvas, like a tent. It had an open cockpit, no radio, no guns for defense, no armor plating, nothing. It was so slow that its maximum speed was only about 94 miles per hour. That's slower than most cars on a highway today. It was so primitive that it had been designed back in 1928. By 1941, it was completely outdated. The Germans were flying Messerschmitt fighters that could go over 350 miles per hour. The Po-2 was basically a flying death trap. And that's what these women were given to fight the most advanced military in the world. But here's the crazy thing. That piece of junk aircraft, that slow, primitive, canvas-covered biplane, it became their greatest weapon. See, the Po-2 was so slow, so low-tech, that it actually had advantages. It could fly very low to the ground, hugging the terrain, making it hard to spot. It could take off and land on tiny makeshift airstrips, even just flat stretches of grass. And most importantly, it was so slow that German fighter planes couldn't effectively shoot it down. The German fighters had a minimum speed of around 120 miles per hour. Any slower, and they'd stall and crash. So when they tried to chase a Po-2 flying at 90 miles per hour, they'd overshoot it. They couldn't match its speed. It was like trying to catch a bicycle while driving a race car. You'd just zoom past it. But that doesn't mean the Night Witches were safe. Far from it. They were still incredibly vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire from the ground. And they had to fly at night, in complete darkness, often in terrible weather, with no instruments to guide them except a compass and a stopwatch. Here's how a typical mission worked, and trust me, this is where it gets absolutely terrifying. Just after sunset, the women would gather for their briefing. They'd be given their targets: German supply depots, ammunition dumps, troop concentrations, artillery positions. Then they'd put on their uniforms. But here's the thing, they didn't have proper uniforms. The Soviet military didn't have women's sizes, so these young women were given men's uniforms that were way too big. Their boots were so large they had to stuff them with newspaper so they wouldn't fall off. Their flight suits dragged on the ground. They looked ridiculous. But they didn't care. They had a job to do. Each Po-2 aircraft had a crew of 2, a pilot in the front seat and a navigator in the back. The navigator's job was to find the target and tell the pilot when to drop the bombs. They carried about 500 pounds of bombs strapped under the wings. Not much, but enough to do serious damage if dropped accurately. Then they'd take off, one after another, into the pitch-black night sky. No lights, no radio communication, just them and the darkness. They'd fly low, sometimes only a few hundred feet above the ground, following roads or rivers to navigate. When they got close to the German positions, they'd climb to about 3,000 feet. And then comes the part that gave them their terrifying reputation. The navigator would tap the pilot on the shoulder, the signal that they were approaching the target. And the pilot would do something absolutely crazy. She would cut the engine completely. The plane would go silent. The only sound would be the wind whistling through the canvas and wooden struts of the aircraft. It made a soft whooshing sound, like a witch's broomstick sweeping through the air. That's why the Germans called them Nachthexen, night witches. The plane would glide silently toward the target. The Germans below wouldn't hear anything. They wouldn't see anything. It was pitch black. And then, at the last possible second, the navigator would release the bombs. Boom! Explosions everywhere. By the time the Germans figured out what was happening, the pilot had already restarted the engine and was flying away into the darkness.
But it wasn't over, not even close. To cause maximum damage and keep the Germans from sleeping, each crew would make multiple runs in a single night, sometimes 8 missions, sometimes 15, sometimes more. They'd fly back to base, reload with more bombs, and go right back out, all night long, every single night. Can you imagine that? Flying in a rickety wooden plane, in total darkness, getting shot at over and over and over again? These women did this night after night after night for years. And the Germans hated them, absolutely hated them. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers couldn't sleep, they couldn't relax. Every night the night witches would come.
Sometimes they drop bombs, sometimes they just fly overhead to keep the Germans awake and terrified. The Germans became so desperate to stop them that they offered an automatic Iron Cross medal, one of their highest military honors, to any pilot who shot down a night witch. Think about that. Shooting down one of these slow, primitive planes was considered as valuable as a major military victory. But the night witches kept coming. And these weren't just nameless faces. These were real women with real stories, and some of them became absolute legends. Let me tell you about a few of them. Nadezhda Popova. She joined when she was 19 years old. Over the course of the war, she flew 852 combat missions. 852! She was shot down multiple times. Her plane was hit by enemy fire 18 times. 18 times she had to somehow land a damaged aircraft in the dark and survive. And she did, every single time. She survived the entire war and lived to be 91 years old. Then there's Irina Sabrova. She holds the record for the most missions flown by any night witch. Over 1,000 combat sorties. 1,000! In 4 years of war. That's an average of almost one mission every single day. But remember, they flew multiple missions per night. This woman was flying nearly every single night for 4 years straight. And Yevdokoya Yasel, she flew 354 missions. But what makes her story incredible is what happened in August 1942. Her plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire and caught on fire. She was burning alive in the cockpit. But instead of bailing out, instead of trying to save herself, she kept the plane steady so her navigator could jump to safety with a parachute. Only then did she try to escape. She managed to jump out at the last second, her clothes on fire, and survived with severe burns. She recovered and went right back to flying missions. Right back. Or Rufina Gasheva and Natalia Meklin, the most famous navigator-pilot duo. They flew over 800 missions together. 800 times they trusted each other with their lives. They were so effective that the Germans put a bounty specifically on them. Both survived the war and were awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor in the country. But not everyone made it. Not everyone survived. 32 women from the 588th Regiment died during the war, shot down, crashed, killed. These were young women, most in their early 20s, who gave their lives fighting the Nazis. One particularly tragic story is that of Yekaterina Ryaba and Nadezhda Studilina. On August 1st, 1943, they were on a mission when their plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire. It burst into flames. They were too low to use parachutes. The plane crashed and both women died instantly. They were 21 and 20 years old. Another heartbreaking story is Vera Bellick. She was one of the regiment's most experienced pilots. In 1943, her plane was shot down during a mission. She survived the crash but was captured by German soldiers. They tortured her, trying to get information about Soviet operations. She told them nothing. They executed her. She was 23 years old. These women knew the risks. They saw their friends die. They attended funeral after funeral. But they never stopped. They never gave up. Because for them, this wasn't just about military strategy or following orders. This was personal. This was revenge. You see, almost every one of these women had lost someone to the Nazis. A father killed in battle, a brother shot, a mother starved during a siege, a hometown burned to the ground. The Nazis had taken everything from them, their families, their homes, their futures. And these women decided that they weren't going to just survive. They were going to fight back. They were going to make the Nazis pay for every single death, every single destroyed home, every single tear. And they did exactly that. Over the course of the war, the Night Witches of the 588th Regiment flew 23,672 combat missions. Let me say that again, 23,672 missions. They dropped over 23,000 tons of bombs on German targets. They destroyed countless supply depots, ammunition dumps, and artillery positions. They killed thousands of German soldiers. They disrupted German operations night after night after night. And they did all of this in planes made of wood and canvas, with no radios, no defensive weapons, no armor, nothing. The psychological impact they had on the German military cannot be overstated. German soldiers wrote in their letters home about their fear of the Night Witches. In diaries recovered after the war, German soldiers described the terror of hearing that soft whooshing sound in the darkness, knowing that bombs were about to rain down on them and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Some German commanders tried to shift their troops' schedules so that soldiers could sleep during the day and be alert at night, but that just made them exhausted and less effective during daytime operations. The Night Witches had created a no-win situation. And the women themselves?
They developed an unbreakable bond. They weren't just colleagues or fellow soldiers, they were sisters. They relied on each other completely. The pilot trusted the navigator to find the target and release the bombs at exactly the right moment. The navigator trusted the pilot to get them there and back safely. The mechanics worked through the night, often in freezing temperatures, to keep those fragile planes flying. Everyone in the regiment depended on everyone else. And they faced discrimination and mockery from male soldiers, especially in the beginning. When they first arrived at the front in 1942, male pilots and commanders didn't take them seriously. They made jokes. They said women couldn't handle combat. They said these girls would break down and cry at the first sign of danger. But the Night Witches proved them wrong, over and over again. After a few months, those same male soldiers were looking at them with respect, even awe. By the end of the war, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment was one of the most decorated units in the entire Soviet Air Force. 23 of these women were awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. 23! That's an enormous number for a single regiment. Almost all of them received the Order of the Red Banner or the Order of the Red Star. And here's something that really shows you how badass these women were. By the end of the war, each pilot had flown an average of 800 missions. 800 missions! In the entire U.S. Air Force during World War II, bomber crews were typically rotated out after just 25 missions because the stress and danger were considered too great. 25 missions and you got to go home. These women flew 800. Some flew over 1,000. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the Night Witches had been fighting non-stop for nearly 4 years. They had flown in every major battle on the Eastern Front: Stalingrad, Kursk, the liberation of Poland, the final assault on Berlin. They had seen unimaginable horrors. They had lost friends. They had been shot at thousands of times. They had crash-landed in enemy territory. They had survived things that would have broken most people. And when Germany finally surrendered, when the war was finally over, these women had to face a new challenge: going home, returning to normal life, trying to process everything they had been through. And sadly, like many veterans, they struggled. The Soviet Union celebrated them as heroes immediately after the war, but as time went on, their story was somewhat forgotten. Unlike male war heroes who were constantly celebrated, the Night Witches faded from public consciousness. Many of them had trouble adjusting to civilian life. How do you go from flying combat missions every night, from being responsible for life and death decisions, from being part of something so important and intense, to just normal life? Some of them stayed in aviation, becoming flight instructors or test pilots. Others went to university, became doctors, engineers, teachers. They got married, had children, lived quiet lives. But the war never really left them. In interviews decades later, many of them said that they still had nightmares. They still heard the sound of anti-aircraft fire in their sleep. They still remembered the faces of the friends they lost. Nadezhda Pakova, the one who flew 852 missions, said in an interview when she was in her 80s that not a single day had passed since the war where she didn't think about it. Not one day in over 60 years. But they also said they were proud of what they accomplished, proud that they fought back, proud that they avenged their families and their country, proud that they proved everyone wrong who said women couldn't fight. And you know what? They should be proud. What these women did was absolutely extraordinary. Think about it. They took the worst piece of equipment. They faced the most powerful military in the world. They were underestimated and mocked, and they became legends. They struck fear into the hearts of Nazi soldiers. They completed more missions than most bomber crews in history. They survived against impossible odds.
The Night Witches weren't just soldiers. They were a symbol of resistance, a symbol of courage, a symbol that showed the world that women could do anything men could do, and sometimes even better. Their story has inspired countless people over the decades. In Russia, they're still remembered as heroes. There are monuments to them, museums dedicated to their story, books, documentaries, even a few movies. And in recent years, their story has finally started to become known around the world. Young women today look at the Night Witches and see role models. They see women who refuse to be victims, women who turned their pain and grief into action,
women who fought back against evil with everything they had. And that's what makes this story so powerful. It's not just a story about war or aviation or military tactics. It's a story about the human spirit, about what people are capable of when they're pushed to their absolute limit, about how ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have a purpose, when they have something worth fighting for. The Night Witches didn't ask for glory. They didn't fight for recognition or medals. They fought because they had to, because their families were dead, because their homes were destroyed, because the Nazis needed to be stopped. And they did stop them. Hitler's army, the most feared military machine in the world, was terrified of these young women in their wooden planes. That says everything you need to know. So the next time you hear someone say that women aren't tough enough for combat, or that they can't handle the stress, or that they don't belong in certain roles, remember the Night Witches. Remember Nadezhda Popova and her 852 missions. Remember Irina Sabrava and her 1,000 sorties. Remember all 400 women of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment who flew into the darkness night after night, knowing they might not come back, but going anyway. Remember that these women dropped 23,000 tons of bombs on Nazi Germany using planes made of canvas and wood. Remember that they were so terrifying that shooting down just one of them earned Germany's highest military honor. The Night Witches are proof that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being absolutely terrified and doing what needs to be done anyway. It's about losing everything and finding the strength to fight back. It's about being underestimated and proving everyone wrong. These women didn't just fight in World War II. They helped win it. They saved countless lives. They changed history. And they did it all while the world told them they couldn't. That's the legacy of the Night Witches. That's why their story matters. That's why we need to remember them. Not just as historical figures, but as reminders of what we're all capable of when we refuse to give up, when we stand together, and when we fight for what's right. The Night Witches flew through the darkness and lit up the night sky with their courage, and that light still shines today, inspiring new generations to be brave, to be strong, and to never, never back down.